There is another suggestion on the table, and that is secession. Just after Doug Ford made his proposal, an outspoken former Toronto city planner entered the race for mayor. Jennifer Keesmaat tweeted this on Thursday saying, secession. Then on Friday, she followed up saying, now I've had a chance to sleep on it. Secession. Why should a city of 2.8 million not have self-governance? The province of Toronto. Does it have a ring to it, or is it just crazy talk? The fact is, this isn't the first time the idea has been floated. Politicians and urban affairs commentators have proposed this idea several times in the last decade. In 2010, Conservative MPP Bill Murdoch suggested making Toronto Canada's 11th province. His argument was that rural areas of Ontario have little clout in the Legislative Assembly of Ontario compared to Toronto. Then Toronto Mayor David Miller indicated he would consider a public debate about the possible secession. These debates faded, but is this an idea whose time has come, or at least come back? Let's ask our pan-Canadian panel tonight, because everyone has an opinion about Toronto. In Toronto, we have Brittany Andrew-Amofa, Policy and Research Manager at the Broadbent Institute. Charles Adler, host of Charles Adler Tonight, joining us from Vancouver. And from Edmonton tonight, Zane Velji, Vice President of Strategy and Communications firm Northweather, joining us now. Okay, Brittany, let me start with you. What do you think? Is it an interesting idea to have Toronto the province?
It kind of has a good ring to it. Well, secession is obviously unrealistic. It would require drastic changes to our Constitution. Opening up the Constitution is no small feat. That is not an easily attainable option. No. But what secession does do, it forces us to have a conversation around who and what Toronto is in the broader context of Canadian society. So as mentioned before, it is a city of a population of 2.8 million. It's extremely diverse, one of the most diverse cities in the world. It is a first stop shop for newcomers. It is, whether we like it or not, the economic engine of our province, of our country. So given these the very distinct nature of Toronto, we should really consider and think about, how do we ensure that a city like this can effectively govern? How do we ensure that a city like this has the powers to more independently govern, considering that it is a city with such broad and unique characteristics? So I like the idea of talking about, how do we give Toronto more powers in order to do what it needs to be done, in order to have strong local representation, and in order for city councillors to do their jobs.
Okay, I want to remind our audience, by the way, that we are streaming live on Facebook right now. Also, we're up on YouTube. If you have questions, put them on Twitter, post to us on Facebook. I'll take them to our panel, and you can get involved in the discussion as well. All right, Zane, let me ask you, is this an unrealistic notion in your opinion?
I mean, Toronto isn't a province already. I mean, I think if you ask half of Torontonians, I think they think they're their own country. And by the way, Carol, I have just written 30 minutes of Toronto jokes, so I actually have no research on the panel. I was just trying out my set on Toronto material, which I'll share for another time. No, listen, I don't think it's realistic, but I think there's two big things that welcome this conversation. Number one, and let me just remove it away from Toronto for half a second. Number one, it's what role do municipalities, especially larger municipalities, play as relation to their province? And I talk here from Calgary, talking about a municipal election we just had about a year to date, and one of the big topics was municipal taxation powers. Edmonton and Calgary being the largest cities in Alberta, but having such limited taxation powers so as to not provide for their own infrastructure and to not remedy the problems that they have within their own cities. And I think that's part of this conversation. Yeah. The second thing that I'll introduce is about the politics and the campaign strategy here for half a second, and just peeling back as to why Ms. Keesmaat has done this. She's a candidate running for mayor that has very little name recognition, and she's getting us to talk about an issue while simultaneously trying to grow a coalition beyond maybe a progressive wing that she might directly speak to. So when we talk about the politics of it, she comes out of it on the other side of it looking like a champion for civic pride, a champion for Toronto in the midst of this argument against Doug Ford. At the end of the day, it's implausible, and the legislation around it, I think, is just totally impractical. But it gets us having this conversation around, what do municipalities within our confederation need to be more powerful in this urban-rural divide that we're seeing scale even more to the urban side of the equation? Okay,
Charles, I'm going to come to you in a second, but I want to go straight to our Facebook page and get some of the comments that people are saying about this right now. There's quite a range from, let's see. Let me start with great campaign platform to lose on. VM D'Souza on Twitter says that's a wacko notion. Susan Burgess, would it be Toronto or the GTA? A lot of people work in Toronto and live in the suburbs. ME comments on YouTube, they should become their own province on the condition they get zero transfer payments from other provinces and no federal handouts when they inevitably go broke. Charles, what do you think?
You know, the thing is, Carol, that one of the things I love most about talk and news talk in summer, the dog days of summer, the hot, stinking, humid days of summer, is that we can have fun with these wacko things. We can have fun with lost causes. This obviously is a lost cause, but tonight our erudite speakers in Alberta and Ontario want to only talk about the big picture. The big picture is not as much fun as the little picture. The little picture is that there is an impulse in Toronto because Doug Ford won, because let's face it, if Doug Ford hadn't won, we wouldn't even be talking about this. So there's an impulse to separate. I have a feeling that happens a lot in this country. We may want to give it the big picture, broader context. I mean, I grew up in Pierre Trudeau's Montreal, in René Lévesque's Montreal, and all of us in the West End, which is where I lived, which was predominantly English speaking, and the West Island, which was predominantly English speaking, we would all, have these fantasies about sort of carving West End Montreal and West Island and Western Quebec out of Quebec. And if we could just carve that into a separate province, we'd never have to worry about separation again.
But Charles, this isn't an impulse. This is an actual thing to consider in the wake of Doug Ford trying to slash and dismantle the fundamental workings of Toronto City Council. Like, this requires us to actually have a conversation around how do we ensure the integrity of Toronto City Council? How do we ensure that democracy and local governance stays intact while we have a premier who's ready to dismantle it immediately in the middle of municipal elections? Like, that is wild in itself. So I do think secession forces us to have conversations around how Toronto can be more effective and govern in a way that provinces can't immediately, well, our premier now can't immediately run in and set his own agenda.
Charles?
So you'd want to reframe this, Brittany, as Toronto, the good citizens of Montreal and the good citizens of Toronto in this case, building a sort of a wall to keep the barbarians out, and Ford Nation represents the barbarians. I'm not trying to make fun. I'm just asking, is that how, Brittany, is that how you'd like to frame this conversation?
That is not how I would like to frame it. How I would like to frame this conversation is how do we ensure the integrity of our democracy? And that is what is at stake here when we are talking about Toronto City Council and what Ford has in plan or in store for this city. And let's not forget, the federal government does have the power to work directly with municipalities. So it's not completely unattainable for the city of Toronto to kind of bypass the provincial government in order to work with its federal counterparts in order to get things done. So this might not be a good route for Premier Ford to go down, because if he does not have, I would say, the best interests of Torontonians in heart, there are other options on the table.
Let me just go to...
Constitutionally, I don't think there's anything. I don't think there's constitutionally anything wrong with having a plebiscite. It wouldn't be binding, but you could put a plebiscite on the next municipal election in Toronto and see how the folks feel about this. That would give you more ammo.
Okay, Pablo Norm on Twitter says, I've lived in Taiwan and Korea where major cities are their own special regions separate from the provinces that contain them. It makes sense to me as these cities' populations are often greater than those of their provinces and have extremely different needs and interests. Melanie Greenham on the same comment. You should be on the same idea. It should be its own district, like DC. Maybe realize, okay, they're not the center of the universe for once. I'm not sure what one has to do with the other, but there you have it. So what about that idea? Zane, why don't you weigh in?
Yeah, I'm pretty calm here. It's really nice to see Charles and Brittany go at it. We talk about secession here in Alberta like every 3 weeks, so I'm just like, whatever. It's old hat for us. Listen, I think, the point that I would really like to make here is around this urban-rural divide. And Carol, we've talked about this on this particular program before. If we're getting serious about this notion, one of the things that I think is quite dangerous from a political point of view, and frankly from a governance and confederacy point of view, is that conversations like this start demonstrating more of the difference rather than trying to bridge more of the commonality. And I'm not criticizing Ms. Keesmaat of trying to do that. I understand her political motives. But the danger here is in a world where we have increasingly more urban-rural divide, an increasing more sort of pointedness towards what that divide is, specifically around topics that individuals in rural communities may care about versus urban communities and urban centers. Conversations like this, I think have a very dangerous slippery slope around what they could mean heading into, commonality of vision and purpose and governance, which is actually what's at the heart of this for both municipalities and provinces at large. And I think it's a really dangerous point of view, not just potentially crazy, but a dangerous point of view when we talk about it in a strict policy confederacy level. And I think that's quite an important conversation to have when we introduce ideas like this.
What about the idea that here's a population of 2.8 million, though, and you look at provinces on the East Coast that are teeny tiny, don't even come close to that. How do you say to the city of Toronto, which is quite unique, as you've all pointed out, and Brittany, you in particular, how do you say, well, how do you get your interests more looked after in the grand scheme of things in this country?
The answer won't be by being Canada's most important city, which it is today, and going down to being Canada's most average province. Because that's what would happen. You would have a city of 2.8 million that sure is the most powerful city, but then would end up being the most average sort of province if it were to secede going forward.
So I think we need... Oh, sorry, don't mean to interrupt, Zane, but I do think we need to scale this back here and really consider the fact that I don't think this was a real plausible or actual serious scenario that Keesmaat was putting forward.
No, of course not. No, but, it's for political gain. Absolutely.
Yeah, but besides the political gain, it's about how do we ensure that municipalities can self-govern more independently. Maybe it's the fundamental flaw of our Constitution that needs to be questioned here, right? And a city of 2.8 million is still a creature of this province. Maybe that's what's dangerous. The fact that the city of Toronto.
Absolutely, and that's same with Vancouver, same with Calgary, same with Ottawa, same with these major municipalities. It's not that portion of the conversation, which I think is fascinating and important, is not isolated to Toronto, but it's isolated to the municipalities across this country in their ability to do taxation, their ability to do social programming, their ability to hyper-focus on what is uniquely important to them. But how do you balance that with an increasing urban-rural divide that is even more tenuous than it has been in our recent past?
Yeah, that's where some people who are open to the idea have over the years agreed it's not good for, they feel Toronto has been getting too much, so they wanted the separation for that reason. Toronto feeling that it's not getting the attention or the money or the power that it deserves, and therefore can't proceed with some of these big ideas that it wants to do, transportation, for example. So that's both sides. There have been people on both sides who have said there's needed to be change, whether they go as far as secession or not, and they agree on the reasons why.
We keep hearing about this urban-rural. I mean, it's not urban-rural at all. It's urban-suburban. I mean, the reason Doug Ford is in there isn't because people in the James Bay region wanted Doug Ford to be in there. People in Mississauga wanted Doug Ford to be there. So I just think that we ought to be clear about this. Otherwise, we get into these stereotypes of, the sophisticated urban folks versus the people in the sticks wearing straw hats and having only one tooth and a lot of shells.
I don't think anyone's implying that, Charles.
I
don't think anyone's implying that. I think the implication here is that there has been a notable value delta, which has in some ways led to the fall of several progressive parties because of their inability to understand, if you call it suburban, I call it rural, whatever that may be, that coalition, that cocktail of voters, whatever their needs are is uniquely different. I think that's at the heart of this conversation.
Yeah.
Well, then why don't we ask the bigger, we keep talking about the bigger picture, the bigger question. Fine. Let's ask the bigger question. Why is it that progressive parties don't take the suburbs seriously? Why is it that big progressive parties aren't the big tents that they'd like to be? That, to me, I think we could all agree is a very important question.
It is a fundamental problem, and we did see that play out here in the Ontario election. I think there was a lot of room for the NDP, and you saw this later on in the election as well, but to have expanded more into the suburban regions of Toronto in itself, but also within Ontario. I think that's a great point.
Let's end on agreement, shall we?
All right.
Brittany Andrew Amofa, Policy and Research Manager at the Broadband Institute, Charles Adler, host of Charles Adler Tonight, and Zane Velji, Vice President, North Weather. Thank you for joining us, and thank you at home, everybody on your cell phones or on your computers, for joining us tonight as well.
Thanks,
Carol.